If you like minions, what's the best starter for the Blacksail season? And why might you play minions in Torchlight Infinite? Minions aren't necessarily the fastest, but they're a very safe and easy way to level up. In fact, I did Tier 6 Traveler, the footage you can see right now, wearing random garbage from the floor. And so far, I've had no issues scaling my build to the point where I can overcome even challenges like Tier 8 Traveler, Path of the Brave, and the Lord of the Void Sea. Don't get me wrong, the playstyle of Moto charge calling is a little bit janky, but you'll have very good damage, great defenses, impeccable sustain, and all around a build that feels really good to play and can do everything you need it to without too many expensive items. I would consider this to be a really well-rounded all-content build. It's probably not the single best boss killer. It's probably not the single best Path of the Brave farmer. And it's definitely not the single best mapper. That probably goes to Erica. But it's good at all of these things, and it can do them well enough that it's not too big of a deal that it doesn't excel at any single one of them. Personally, I like my builds to be all-rounders, and I like my builds to have good defenses, and I like them to feel good to play. So far, this does all of those things quite nicely, and it's certainly been my smoothest season start to date, though I guess that would mean more if this wasn't the game's second season. But before I get into too many details about my gear, I did want to take a moment to talk about some important mechanics. Yes, I'm blowing up spider tanks, but somehow this counts as melee. Don't ask me, don't ask Moto, you'd have to ask the spider tanks, and they don't seem to be programmed to talk. But going forward, as I talk about some of the mechanics, keep in mind that these are spider tanks that are dealing most of their damage with melee. The explosions themselves scale off the minion's attack, so things that would normally increase your damage do all apply, levels, damage, double damage, etc. And, due to our hero trait, they scale off of a minion's life and ES, so anything you can do to pump up their defensive numbers will in fact scale their damage as well, though to a slightly lesser degree than scaling their damage directly. The other important note is, right now I'm using 2 minion skills. This is because when one is triggered, if I happen to press the button at exactly the same time, I would oversummon, exceeding the skill's total minion limit and causing the minions to die instantly. They don't get to explode, which makes me sad, makes them sad, and makes the enemies quite happy. Generally, in ARPGs, you don't want to make the enemies happy, so use 2 minion skills to avoid this issue. The first one will trigger itself automatically, and you'll be spamming the second most of the time. Unfortunately, this doesn't do anything to solve Moto's perpetual energy starvation problem, but it is definitely in line with everything else he's done so far. And so now, let's get into a quick overview of your skills. So, to start off with, Summon Spider Tank. Normally the gimmick of this minion is it scales off of your attack speed. Unfortunately, that doesn't matter because it's just going to charge at an enemy and blow itself up. Though, I guess applying 40% of your attack speed to its movement speed doesn't hurt anything. It doesn't really seem to increase the charge speed, so I've largely been ignoring that. Now, when it comes to any minion build at all, you definitely want to use mechanical modification. This increases minions' physique, making them larger, but it also gives them additional life and additional damage. Because of a very large multiplier, and because you get to effectively ignore the minion limit anyway, this is a massive damage bonus that shouldn't be ignored. From there, I'm also using Steamroll. Remember, a minion's attack speed doesn't matter, so the penalty is a non-issue, and this gives 49% additional melee damage for our melee charge spiders, as they happily blow themselves up on the enemy. From there, I'm using Crit Strike Rating Increase and Crit Strike Damage Increase. I think ultimately it's better to drop Crit Strike Rating Increase once you have suitable gear. I'm just not quite there yet. And finally, I'm using Mark Support. Marked enemies take increased Crit Strike damage, which will increase the damage both of this Summon Spider Tank and the other one, though the supported skill dealing 30 additional damage to marked enemies only applies to this one. Now on my other Spider Tank, I'm using Tendon Slicer. I didn't need to run double mark, and the additional Fizz damage plus chance to ignore armor does seem to add quite a lot since we are pure Fizz. Next up, let's get into some of the defenses and utilities. I quite like Resurrection Warcry, since with Lion's Roar I'm able to get 3 charges and spam it pretty frequently. Emergency Restoration is great, you're always on low mana, and when you're on low life, it'll be even that much more effective. And of course, Armor Infusion for additional defenses, since it has 3 charges and you should use them pretty liberally. For movement, I settled on Shadow Dash. What I like about Shadow Dash is it has 2 base charges. I'm combining this with quick mobility and cooldown reduction to get as low of a cooldown as possible, and I've added periodic burst here just for a little bit more attack and cast speed after I reposition. This part is very much only because I couldn't fit any energy in elsewhere, and I'll probably drop it later. For now though, feels pretty nice. And finally, because the build already does all the damage, I decided to drop my curse for a safeguard ring. Safeguard ring is really nice for adding minus 21.5% additional damage taken while the buff lasts. There is also a further bonus when enemies are trying to deal damage to you from outside the ring. So you're very resistant to ranged attacks and somewhat resistant to melee attacks. You could instead go with a curse-like vulnerability here. However, personally, I found Safeguard Ring to be the better option and haven't felt like my damage is lacking in any situation. For auras, the most important is Fearless. Remember, this is a melee build. This helps to cap out your crit, gives you a little radius and a nice chunk of crit strike damage. Though you could go Weapon Amplification instead, that does scale your damage really well, and ultimately which one's better depends on your crit rating. Beyond that, I'm also using Erosion Enhancement, due to the 14.5% additional damage to life and the only 30% reservation. My other auras are Magical Source and Swiftness, which is really just pure utility and quality of life. As long as you can sustain mana, the levels don't really matter on this, but if you can't sustain mana, keep leveling up Magical Source, and if you can, put the extra mana into Swiftness. And then finally, I'm using Auto Defense with Protection Field. Protection Field transfers damage to a random nearby minion. I should always have nearby minions, and it's not like they need their life anyway. Alternatively, you could use the defense skill Reform here. The nice advantage of having Reform is that your barrier is super powerful, so reactivating it after you've taken damage is a great alternative. It should be noted that Reform does last 3 seconds, along with giving additional barrier absorption while the skill lasts. Play around with these, see what's best, maybe also consider something like Cast on Damage Taken instead of Auto Defense. Next up, let's take a look at the gear. Now, I'm hesitant to say what items were cheap and or expensive due to the fact that prices have shifted around significantly since I bought a lot of this stuff. What I will say is you can use 2 interlocking souls, but I highly advise making sure that at least one of them has this modifier right here. Restores 3% of max life when summon skills are used. Normally, this mod consumes 5% of your max life, which means summoning more minions will cost quite a lot, and that cost will add up. In this case, with these 2 interlocking souls, instead of it costing life, I'm actually gaining life. I heal by summoning more things to blow up more enemies to summon more things to heal from more damage. The other item that I got super early that was, again, very inexpensive for me was Winter of Origin. I paid 25 FE for this, and I expect the price has risen. One very important thing to pay attention to are these 2 lines. Own a certain number of additional stacks of Focus Blessing, and additional cooldown recovery speed when you have no less than a certain number. Whenever possible, you do want to have both of these active, so just read the text and apply it accordingly. Though, that said, if you're on a budget, beggars can't be choosers, and usually to activate it, you do need a Corrosion. 16% additional cooldown recovery when you have no less than 6 stacks of Focus Blessing. Own 5 additional is not quite 6. But hey, maybe I'll corrode it, or get lucky in the future. The ones with 6 and 6 were unfortunately quite pricey, as the rolls are a little bit random. You can see here it's 4 to 6 and 5 to 7. For my other legendary item, I'm using Mind Infusion. I got 4% max energy shield, which does basically nothing for me. These boots are quite nice because they have +1 minion skill level and +1 max synthetic troop minion quantity. If you don't have this, you need maniacal army support. Otherwise, you won't be able to summon 3 minions with a single cast, while also using mechanical modification. Unfortunately, it does increase your skill cost by 83%, which is why it's so important to have that leveled up magical source. Now for the rest of my gear, it's really just crafted rares. Minion life is damage, so be sure to add that wherever possible. Get res and erosion res. Capping erosion is especially important when fighting the Lord of the Void Sea. I like armor bases to help mitigate fizz damage. Max life is very good, percent max life also very good. Alternatively, you could do something like Fizz Taken As. I've got a little bit of life regen. The build doesn't strictly need life regen, as it has a ton of recovery anyway, but it definitely doesn't hurt, and I should probably finish this with the armor and max life mod. I made a couple of these items shortly before recording this video, which is why they're slightly unfinished. This is because I realized I've been doing T8 content with around 30% cold res and 200% fire res. So I had to fix that real quick. Not something that I advise doing, by the way, though the build is certainly able to handle it. Then for my rings, I went with life regeneration speed to try to get my healing up, and regenerates life per second. leaving one suffix and one prefix open. The suffix was to fill in res, which I didn't end up needing, and the prefix was for minus skill cost, which I also didn't end up needing, though I should probably put a cheap enchantment there for any sort of damage that I can get. And finally, I have this lovely neck that I picked up off the floor. It is garbage, and I probably should replace it. But hey, it's really good garbage that's been doing its job, and at least that's something. If you want to see a more min-maxed version of a build, do get subscribed, and while you're down there, leave a like on the video, since I'm sure I'm going to be talking about it in the future. But because this is more of a season starter, I wanted to show pretty realistic gear, which happened to be the random janky trash that I was wearing when I first killed Tier 8 Traveler and Lord of the Void Sea. And speaking of, yes, you heard that correctly. With the gear that I've just showcased, I've taken down Tier 8 Ghost Bride. The fight usually lasts about a minute. Lord of the Void Sea, that fight took a long time, and it's definitely not easy. The Alchemist tree with removing damage over time effects when you use the Restoration skill was carrying hard. I've killed Tier 8 Traveler. That one's not too bad. During the Spiral phase, you can continually summon minions to block the purple spiral things, which means you take no damage from them. Though do watch for puddles on the ground, and unfortunately his melees do hurt quite a lot. In terms of a playstyle, it's fairly simple. If you need to dodge stuff, try to pick up all the mechanical scrap so that you keep automatically summoning more minions. If you get to stand still in tunnel, just hold down your summon minion button to spam as many of them as possible directly into the enemy. Watch those numbers fly, they'll often be in the hundreds of millions. Overall, the playstyle's pretty forgiving. The build has really solid defenses with barrier, and a ton of recovery from active superflux, though I'll get into that more once I talk about the talents. If you want the fastest mapper possible, then I don't suggest this build. Instead, I suggest my Berserking Blade Thunder / Erica. In fact, this is the very same build that two other Maxwell members, Mike1Up and Milky BK, are using to absolutely dominate the leaderboards. Be sure to go check them out on Twitch and YouTube if you want to see more about their takes on that build. But I'm not really a player who likes to go fast. If anything, I just hate dying. And this build is really tanky. In fact, it's far more tanky than the Erica build. Plus, it's a lot better suited to bosses, since a lot of your damage happens passively. You walk over mechanical scrap, then more minions are summoned, the minions explode which generates scrap, therefore you can walk over it and summon more minions. Because it happens passively, you have very good damage uptime, whereas Erica is a little bit more skill intensive, and while you're dodging the boss, you're definitely not killing it. Both builds are excellent, it's definitely going to come down to your own personal taste and playstyle. For more information about the Erica build, check out the video in the card, the description below, or the guides on Maxroll. But how does Moto's Charge Calling trait work? And what talents should you pick up? Charge Calling works by causing your minions to self-destruct. This makes them explode, causing them to die, and hopefully causing everything around them to also die. Some of the most important talents to focus on are at level 32 Quick Battle. This is what lets you scale your minions' damage through their life, which unlocks a whole lot of different scaling vectors. Adds base physical damage equal to 16% of a sum of a synthetic troop minion's max life and energy shield to the self-destruct caused by self-destruction protocol. Try to say self-destruct caused by self-destruction protocol 3 times fast. Also, it helps to maintain overload on all of your minions, so long as you're able to spam your gauge points. Next up, at level 62, we have Guerrilla Tactics. This causes synthetic troop skills to automatically be triggered when you pick up mechanical parts. This is why your main skill will just endlessly loop itself, allowing you to dodge very easily on bosses. And for each part collected, you get 4% additional damage, stacking up to 15 times. You also get a nice bit of AoE, stacking up to 15 times, so your minions hit in a wider radius. Finally, at level 80, Meaningful Death. Your minions aren't dying for nothing after all. They're dying to increase the damage of your other minions. I did try Fuel War with War for a little bit, and while clearing it's not bad, but on single target, you definitely notice the damage loss. Then, in terms of my hero relic, I'm using 42% minion max life, and 5% chance for synthetic troops with overload to drop a mechanical part when hitting enemies. Ultimately, this might not be the best in slot trait, as I haven't quite figured out if there's something better than the 5% chance for synthetic troops to drop a mechanical part. It does definitely seem like, as they do their final self-destruct, they have a chance to generate extra parts, and that's not too bad. But I'm going to keep experimenting and buying different combos in the future. For example, I tried this one for plus 1000% max energy shield, and unfortunately it was pretty lackluster. On the other hand, for your memories, 10% additional self-destruct damage is by far your best in slot. Beyond that, I've been experimenting between Focus Blessing and scaling for max life. Again, I'll get back to you with the min-max version of a build once I've found out what's actually best. I'm leaning towards 14% of a player's max life added as base life to minions, because that'll then be scaled by all of your bonuses as well. But the only thing I can conclusively say right now is the additional self-destruct damage, with additional acting as a more multiplier, is absolutely best in slot, and the second trait is far less important. Now, let's take a quick look at the build's talent choices. Starting off, the newly buffed Orders. 20% additional minion damage is, well, 20% more damage, and 100% additional summon skill cast speed is quite nice when you're spamming your skill as much as this build does. Then, I've also gone for Mighty Guard for the +3 minion skill level. If I had a better weapon, I might actually want Isomorphic Arms instead, applying my main hand weapon to minions, giving them all the global modifiers on the item. In general, if you're a minion build, you're probably going to be using God of Machines, and I've gone through to pick up your basic minion damage nodes, minion crit nodes, and of course, max life, since max life is really good for scaling damage. I've also got Barrier for some personal defense, and a little bit more life regeneration speed, though these points here are less important and should be picked up after you've filled out everything else. Do try to pick up this node fairly early on. 30% max life and 25% aggressiveness makes the mapping feel far more responsive. Next up, there is the recently buffed Machinist tree. Boss is important for the +1 to synthetic troop minion quantity. You'd need a total of +2 if you didn't have boss, which you can get from various minion items, and or just leveling your minion gem up by that much more. Additionally, I'm taking Kinetic Conversion. 20% less damage taken while moving, and 100% chance to gain barrier for every 5 meters you move. This effectively means your barrier will be up almost 100% of the time, except when you're standing still. So don't stand in too many boss abilities, do try to move around, and remember, this build is great at dealing damage while moving. In terms of the individual talent nodes chosen, there's honestly not much here that's very interesting, though I did want to point out towards the end one thing that's kind of unusual. That is, I'm taking this Sentry node. That way, when I drop my safe card, I have a decent chance to refresh my barrier if I haven't been moving a lot. I don't think this talent's mandatory, but if you're a lazy player like I am, it's definitely nice to have so that you can stand still and tunnel the boss while still keeping up your major defense. Speaking of, the Alchemist tree is where you get a lot of your defenses and, more importantly, a lot of your recovery. It does have some decent minion nodes, both damage and crit strike rating. That's not really why I've taken the trait. Empower gives 25% of your max life to barrier absorption. Since we want to stack life to transfer it over to our minions, we want to stack life to make our barrier stronger. This essentially just lets you double dip, gaining even more defense. On the other hand, if you have one or more interlocking soul that is not corroded, I suggest Contingency instead. This will give you additional life regeneration speed for every 2% life lost. If you're losing 5% life with every cast and gaining 3 back, that's going to be a lot of additional life regeneration speed, which will make your life regeneration kick into overdrive. Then at level 36, the source of our main recovery. Active Superflux. Overflown mana regeneration is applied to life, regenerates 3% of mana per second. It's pretty hard to get % life regen, but relatively easy to get % mana regen. So by stacking % mana regen, we also increase our life regen, since our mana regen's always going to be overflowing, and this means that you can stand in, well, frankly, a horrifying amount of damage. You'll pretty much just heal through anything that doesn't one-shot you outright. Now, outside of the damage talents, a couple other important things to grab include minor talents for life regen, since we want more recovery, mana regen, since this is basically just life regen, and all the way at the end, one talent that's really, really important. Restoration skill restoration effect, actually not too important. We do use a restoration skill. The reason we use it is for this. Removes all dot damage when using restoration skills. A lot of the bosses, like Traveler and Lord of the Void Sea, have very dangerous dots, and being able to remove them with Resurrection Warcry largely trivializes the scariest part of these encounters. Finally, what pets am I using? Like with many of my builds, nothing too special. I've got a couple of otters on to try to get extra elemental resistances so that I'm nicely capped, and a little bit of life. Then I have a plaintive ball of thread for even more life. In general, if you want, you can use damage pets, but this build already does so much damage that I prefer to focus on defenses and get more damage on my gear. Especially as you equip offensive legendaries, resists are going to become a little harder to find, and this is a good way to make up for that extra resistance, while also contributing some damage, because remember, a percentage of your life is transferred over to the minions. And so that is my Explodo, or should it be called Moto build? A Moto charge calling setup that focuses on rapidly summoning spider tanks so that they can explode on enemies, and then rapidly desummon themselves to resummon themselves to make sure that all the enemies turn into piles of loot. This build has been an incredible season starter. I killed tier 6 Traveler wearing nothing but the items that I'd picked up off the floor, including a couple of interlocking souls. Then I used my early profits to buy a couple of key legendary items, and was able to farm the rest of the game without too much difficulty. I'm sure as I continue to improve my gear, I'm going to be able to farm Path of the Brave 5, do multi-invitation Lord of the Void Sea, and if I really want to, take down Uber Keegan. In terms of things that change, honestly, not too much, though I should probably figure out exactly how the build scales at some point, since I'm not quite sure what the sweet spot is between increasing minion life, transferring my own life to minions, increasing my own life, and causing minions to get all sorts of nifty damage inheritance. One thing that's for sure, there are way too many ways to scale this build, and none of this even considers the fact that I could always just go Decayed Mind. So if you want a build that's really easily able to kill bosses, feels great to play, and has almost unlimited upwards damage scaling potential, maybe check out Exploding Moto. Again, if you want to see this build in action, be sure to get subscribed, as I'm going to continue playing it and therefore continue min-maxing it. Or you can check out another Maxwell member ZenM, either here on YouTube or over on Twitch, as he's also playing the build and has a slightly different take. Plus, if you're looking for a written guide, hopefully there's going to be one soon, and if there is, just check down in the description. And if not, I'll try to get it finished as soon as I can. But now I have a question for you. What's your season start experience been in Blacksail so far? Or maybe you haven't started, in which case, do you think Moto Charge Calling is a build for you? Let me know some of your thoughts down in the comments below. And of course, before I go, a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for their continued support. If you're looking for something else to watch, maybe check out my Erica build, or whatever YouTube's recommending on screen right now. That's all for me today. I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you again sometime soon.